Bonjour tout le monde. Hello and welcome to this session of the MIS Annual Conference, which focuses on national unity in Canada. Je vais maintenant vous présenter notre modérateur, Jonathan Montpetit, or Jonathan Montpetit. Jonathan is a senior digital journalist with CBC News in Montreal, where he covers Quebec politics. He is spending the 2021-2022 academic year as a journalism fellow at Massey College, University of Toronto. We are very grateful to have him here with us to lead this discussion. Jonathan, c'est à toi. Merci.
Merci bien, Daniel. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Hello, as Daniel said, my name is Jonathan Montpetit, and I'm very pleased to be moderating this panel today on national unity in Canada. I'm speaking to you from Massey College in Toronto, which is located on land that has been occupied and inhabited by many Indigenous peoples and communities over the years. It's the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, who are the treaty holders of this land, and I'd like to acknowledge our duty and stewardship to this land. When the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada was founded back in 1994, national unity was at the center of its mandate. And indeed, the issue was at the top of mind of most Canadians as the country prepared for the second referendum on Quebec independence. Needless to say, the country has changed a lot since then. And our panel today will help us trace how national unity debates have evolved over the years. What divides Canadians? What holds this country together? I want to thank our panelists in advance for lending their invaluable perspectives to this conversation. We'll hear brief remarks from each of them before moving on to questions that will touch on a range of topics, including regional economic interests, climate change, and Indigenous relations. Now, allow me to introduce our esteemed guests for this discussion. Jean Charest served as the 5th Deputy Prime Minister of Canada in 1993 and as the 29th Premier of Quebec from 2003 to 2012. He served as the leader of the Federal Progressive Conservative Party of Canada from 1993 to 1998 and as the leader of the Quebec Liberal Party from 1998 to 2012. He currently sits as an advisor to Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission and is a partner in McCarthy Tetra's Montreal office, where he provides expertise to the firm's clients and his in-depth knowledge and experience with public policy, corporate Canada, and international matters. Christy Clark was the Premier of British Columbia, Canada's 3rd largest province, for 6 years. Throughout her tenure, Ms. Clark demonstrated the strongest performance of any Canadian Premier for economic growth, fiscal management, and job creation. She is currently an advisor at Bennett Jones, where she offers clients insights tied to her experience in infrastructure, Canada-Asia trade, natural resources, social license, and Indigenous relations. And André Lecourt is full professor in the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa. His main research interests are Canadian politics, European politics, nationalism with a focus on Quebec, Scotland, Flanders, Catalonia, and the Basque Country. He is the editor of New Institutionalism Theory and Analysis, the author of Basque Nationalism and the Spanish State, and is the co-author with Daniel Bélan of Nationalism and Social Policy, The Politics of Territorial Solidarity. Premier Charest, why don't you begin by sharing your opening remarks on national unity?
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I do want to also say how delighted I am to join this panel with André Lecourt, who is already very well known, and on a subject that will always be very relevant to Canada on how nationalism it plays out in other parts of the world in regards to identity politics and the issues of countries who have within their scope or within their own existence this issue of possible breakups. And Christy Clark, who is a very good friend and was Premier when I was also Premier, and with whom I enjoyed an extraordinary relationship, and has a lot to say about this country in regards to her own contributions, but also as we look to the future. I want to thank McGill for inviting me, and the institute that was created in 1994. I remember arrived at a moment that was very intense for Canada in regards to our future. The '95 referendum was a seminal moment in the history of our country, with a very, very tight outcome. You'll remember only 50,000 votes separated the Federalist from the Separatist side, and a participation rate in that referendum that was, I think, 94%, unheard of in regards to what we've seen today. Now we're looking ahead, a little more than 25 years later since the creation of the Institute and where we are. And a lot has happened. I mean, first of all, if I reach back into my own experience, I moved from the leadership of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada after the 97 campaign to the leadership of the Liberal Party of Quebec. And not a lot of people noticed in regards to what had happened then, but the referendum of 95 went unresolved because of the outcome that was so tight. And it was finally resolved and put to bed in the 1988 provincial election campaign, which I was part of. Lucien Bouchard and I faced off, and the campaign did not go very well for me. I was new to Quebec politics, and it was quite a learning curve. But in the last 12 days of the campaign, we focused on one single issue: no referendum. Because at that point, the plan of Lucien Bouchard and the sovereignists was to hold a third referendum. And that they could have very well have won. I mean, Lucien Bouchard was a very powerful, charismatic leader. But in the last 12 days of that campaign, we campaigned on that issue only, pas de référendum, to the point where it drove the media crazy. On election night, Lucien Bouchard and the Péquistes won a plurality of, the majority of the seats, I should say. But the Liberal Party of Quebec won the plurality of the votes. And Lucien acknowledged since then that the third referendum went out the window that night. It was done. And the referendum of 95 was finally put to bed, which, is a lesson in life. The most important election campaign I was part of in my lifetime is the one I lost, not the one I won. And so it gave the country time to breathe and to be able to catch its breath. Looking ahead, we entered a period that I described as administrative federalism, where we deliberately set aside any project or ambition of a constitutional amendment, if only because we were worn out by it, because we also felt that this was a trap, a tripwire that the separatists dearly wanted, and Lucien Bouchard and other sovereignists kept complaining that the Federalist side weren't advancing any new constitutional amendments because they knew full well, as Jacques Parizeau had acknowledged in an interview, that the only hope, or the hope they had of regaining momentum for separation, was that there'd be another failed attempt on which they could build a narrative to separate Quebec from Canada. This period of, I'll call administrative federalism, was nonetheless quite productive. We prepared very rigorously for the 2003 campaign, and Benoit Pelletier and myself toured the country, met with government leaders in every province and the opposition parties, having learned from them each experience that they were very much at the table on these issues, and made a whole series of recommendations and things we wanted to change. And right after our election, we were able to create the Council of the Federation at the annual meeting of premiers and PEI in 2003. And the council's worked very well since then. The high watermark of the council, I felt, was in 2004 at the meeting that Paul Martin had organized in Ottawa, a 3-day meeting based on the Romano report on the future of healthcare. Sound familiar? And the funding of healthcare, where Quebec walked away with an agreement that not only secured long-term funding for the next 10 or 15 years at 6% increase a year, which was for healthcare a very reasonable amount, but also the recognition of asymmetrical federalism. So the concept wasn't new, but in the agreement that we signed, I, at the time, personally insisted that every single premier sign the document in which there was this agreement on asymmetrical federalism, which I think continues to be very much part of the things and the concepts we should look at in the future. We were, interestingly enough, able to amend our constitution in 98. It was the separatist government of Mr. Bouchard who had the confessional school sections of the Canadian Constitution amended successfully in Ottawa. And then we went on to a period that I would say of some constitutional peace, but nonetheless on the Fed-Prob side, most of the preoccupations were about public finances, balancing the budgets, deficits, and a whole series of changes that ensued in that period. And there was some relative peace, but I would close by saying and offering a word of caution. For any given premier, prime minister in this country, national unity is among the most important issues that we face. Canada is a country that always needs to look ahead and have some common project in front of us. I'm very worried right now. I see a great deal of angst and anxiety in Western Canada. In fact, there's this referendum on equalization in Alberta. It's in Saskatchewan also, a great sense of uneasiness in British Columbia. And we've just went through a federal election campaign where I didn't hear a lot about the future of the country, of common values, of things that we need to build on. I think that's a dangerous place to be. Anyone who thinks that this issue of national unity has gone away is really dreaming in Technicolor. Just in Quebec, I'll give you an example. In the National Assembly in Quebec, there's 4 parties. 3 of them are led by separatists. François Legault was among the most radical of the separatists when he was in the Péquist governments. He never said he wasn't a separatist anymore. Quite to the contrary. Listen to his answers, who are very, very well crafted on these issues. He's not a federalist, he said, but he sort of suspends his belief. But 3 out of 4 parties are led by separatists. And the only Federalist party in the National Assembly in Quebec isn't saying a lot about federalism. In the House of Commons, there's 32 seats for the Bloc Québécois out of the 78 in Quebec. Totally devoted to the idea of separation with the resources and the money that comes with that. And so does anyone really think that this issue has gone away? I don't think so, not at all. But what I worry about the most is our sense now of complacency on this issue, when in fact, I think national leaders need to now look seriously at the future of the country and the period we're in and ask ourselves, what are the things we need to do to be able to make this country more cohesively and effectively? Coming out of the pandemic, it's an opportunity to look at how federalism worked in the context of the pandemic. I'm hoping that will happen. And I think it's extremely important for the future of the country that our leaders do that.
Thanks so much, Premier Charest. Lots to chew on there. Premier Clark, why don't you go next?
All right. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thanks to McGill for my son goes to school in the States. And when I tell people that I'm the chair of the advisory board for the School of Public Policy at McGill, they all say, you're at the Harvard of the North, which is, it's the only university that gets that kind of recognition south of the border. And so I'm really proud to be part of this with McGill. And of course, with Andre, the work that you've done, as Jean said, has been really, really vitally important for Canadians to understand ourselves, and a contribution to the world to take Canada's lessons and lessons from places around the world and apply them across jurisdictions. And of course, Jean Charest, who is quite modest in talking about his contribution to Canada. I was there when Jean Charest stood up and made his speech, his passionate speech for Canada. And what people forget is, until he made that speech, the forces of unity were losing the referendum. And I always, when we worked together, I always used to call him Captain Canada, which I don't think he loved, but from a Westerner's perspective, it was meant as a great compliment, because Canada really matters to all of us. The idea of unity really matters, and whether or not we feel like we have a lot in common, the reality is we have a lot of necessity that binds us together, if only for economic reasons. And so a couple of comments there. First, I think it's important to understand that Western Canada is not just 4 places. Manitoba probably, central Canada to most of us. Alberta and Saskatchewan are quite similar. British Columbia is kind of 2 places. There's the interior in the north, which is a lot like Alberta and Saskatchewan, and then there's Vancouver Island and the Lower Mainland, which is a lot, I guess, more like Ontario than anywhere else. It's urban, it's progressive, whatever that means, but I have never seen I've never seen the West so agnostic about the idea of Canada as it is now. Now, the interesting thing about Alberta is that it's a province that has, I think, loved Canada more than the idea of Canada and their sense of being Canadians more than any other province, except maybe Ontario, which is, I think, part of the reason they get so angry when they feel like they're not really getting their due inside the country. But I think most British Columbians and a lot of Canadians, if you ask them, they would say they don't really think about national unity a whole lot. And really, if Quebec decided to separate, what difference really would that make? I really feel like we're at an inflection point in Canada where people care less about the idea of a united country than we have in my lifetime. And there was an animating idea that bound the country outside of Quebec together, which was we were English Canada, and our country was founded on a bargain between the French and the English, and that was fundamentally who we were. But there really is no English Canada anymore in the West. We are a profoundly multicultural place, newly, much more deeply aware of the work of Indigenous, the contribution of Indigenous people. People don't really think about that English-French bargain as much as they used to. And I guess I just close by saying this, which is echoing what Premier Charest had to say. I think part of the reason that Canadians are a lot less interested in, maybe are a little bit meh about national unity, is because there is no one fighting for national unity in Canada anymore. And it is the central job of the Prime Minister of this country, and I'm sure Professor Lacour has lots of experience in viewing this from countries around the world. If the federal government isn't fighting for the federation, no one is. And no one's been talking about how we hold Canada together, how important it is. And no one's been talking about the central values that make us Canadian enough. And so in the absence of a federal government that's really talking about national unity, that's sharing the central values that bind us together, that define us as Canadians, I think we've kind of lost the thread. And my worry is when a referendum happens again in Quebec, that you won't have as many people across the country tearing their hair out, watching the results on referendum night, as we have in the past, because there won't be as many people who care anymore. And that will be, I would argue, the failure of our current federal government to not only defend Canada, but even more than that, to spend, how many years it's been now, 8 years, trying to just use provincial governments and provincial premiers as punching bags, because fighting all the time only really makes the point that our federation isn't working. And in the absence of any argument for why it should work, I'm worried that Canada's really, really in a very bad spot should Quebec and Quebecers decide they want to separate. And we need to move past that. As a Canadian, I'm worried.
Thank you so much, Premier Clark, for that very sobering assessment. Professor Lacour, why don't you go ahead and take this conversation forward?
All right, thank you. Well, I will echo a lot of the remarks of the two premiers, and I'll do so in French since I know we have simultaneous translation. Au chapitre de l'unité nationale, on sait que l'appui à l'indépendance du Québec a beaucoup diminué au cours des dernières décennies. Et je suis tout à fait d'accord avec M. Charest que la décision par la classe politique canadienne d'abandonner les réformes constitutionnelles en faveur d'ententes administratives, à mon avis, a été la clé, une des clés de ce changement dans le positionnement politique de beaucoup de Québécois. Parce que lorsqu'on parlait de réformes constitutionnelles au Canada, on avait une situation qui était essentiellement statique et rigide, tandis qu'en exploitant les mécanismes du fédéralisme, je pense qu'on a pu rendre la Fédération canadienne plus dynamique et plus flexible. Donc ça, je pense que ça a beaucoup contribué à faire baisser l'appui à l'indépendance du Québec. Et on voit, lorsqu'on regarde les statistiques sur l'appui à l'indépendance, que les jeunes, ceux et celles, par exemple, qui n'ont pas vécu les négociations constitutionnelles des années 80 et 90, sont beaucoup moins portés à appuyer l'indépendance du Québec. En même temps, comme l'a dit M. Charest, je pense que le nationalisme québécois, il est là pour rester. Et que même si présentement l'appui à l'indépendance est plus bas qu'il ne l'a été précédemment, pour la classe politique canadienne, ce sera toujours une force politique qu'on devra gérer. Et je pense que c'est l'attitude qui doit être prise, c'est-à-dire il ne faut pas penser que maintenant, le nationalisme québécois est mort, on peut passer à d'autres choses, à des choses présumément plus importantes. Hein. Nous vivons dans un pays multinational et comme le disait la première ministre Clark, c'est une tâche qui incombe à tout gouvernement fédéral canadien. Donc, je pense que ça, c'est très important. Maintenant, je pense que la question de l'unité nationale elle-même, il y a d'autres couches qui s'y sont rajoutées. Hein? En plus du nationalisme québécois, évidemment, il y a, je pense, une nouvelle vague d'aliénation de l'Ouest. Hein? C'est de cette manière-là que je la comprendrais. Ce n'est pas un nouveau phénomène, mais il y a une nouvelle vague qui n'amène peut-être pas des menaces immédiates ou même à moyen terme d'indépendance, mais qui très certainement mine la solidarité territoriale de la Fédération canadienne. Hein? Donc, je pense qu'on peut voir une question d'unité nationale comme étant non seulement la menace d'une sécession, mais aussi la qualité de la solidarité territoriale au Canada. Et on voit que présentement, à travers le questionnement sur le programme de péréquation en Alberta et aussi en Saskatchewan, l'étendue ou peut-être la nature de cette solidarité-là, elle est questionnée. Et finalement, je veux terminer aussi en disant quelques mots sur les peuples autochtones au Canada. Hein? Donc, il y a aussi là une question de solidarité entre les Autochtones et les non-Autochtones au Canada, entre les leaders autochtones et les gouvernements fédéraux et provinciaux. Il y a des promesses de réconciliation qui probablement devront à un certain moment s'opérationnaliser peut-être un peu mieux qu'elles l'ont été, même si c'est très difficile. Ça, je pense, c'est un défi important aussi à l'unité nationale si on la comprend là, en termes de solidarité. So I'll end my remarks on national unity here.
Merci beaucoup, Professor LaCour. Let me pick up on something I think all three of you mentioned, and it's Indigenous relations. And for a long time, I think the concept of national unity referred essentially to the relationship between English and French Canada, right? As Premier Clark mentioned, that of course is only part of the story of our country, and we're finally having discussions about a variety of issues about anti-Black racism, and we're only just now really coming to terms with the full horror of the residential school system in Canada. I'd like to hear from all of you on this. How has this process of reckoning that we're undergoing, reckoning with our past, with ongoing social injustices, how has this process of reckoning changed the way you guys think about national unity in Canada? And why don't we go the other way this time? Professor LaCour, let's begin with you.
Well, I think it's taking us from a concept of unity to a concept of justice, I guess, to something that's a little bit different and perhaps a little bit more elusive as well, right? So I think, the political class in Canada has there's a collective memory, right, about how to attempt to work on national unity as it has been traditionally defined, which is, the Quebec question, nationalism in Quebec and secessionist threats and so on and so forth. But I'm not sure that we exactly know what national unity as involves Indigenous people, what that exactly means, right? And really, of course, it's not about secession. It's not even about autonomy, right? It's about justice. It's about inclusion. So it's about quite different things, which I think, I think in the case of Quebec, it was easier to manage Quebec in practice than in theory. It was hard to acknowledge Quebec as a nation, and it was easier to manage it as a movement and answering the claims of the Quebec political class. I think in the case of Indigenous peoples, it's harder to manage in practice than in theory, right? So it's easier to say, okay, there are First Nations in Canada. They've been horribly treated. They've been victims of colonialism. But how do we restructure this relation? And we should reconcile, we should have reconciliation. And so those words have been said and that discourse has been held, but I think that's the easy part in a way. And the more difficult part, as I said before, I think is to find a way to operationalize that in a way that will have some support also amongst non-Indigenous Canadians, right? A pure nation-to-nation relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians, between First Nations and the Canadian state, a pure nation-to-nation relationship, one-on-one, is not, I think, something that can be really politically operationalized. So I think we have to find ways to translate that into practice.
Premier Clark, what do you have to say about this issue?
Well, I think that this is something we've been thinking about a lot in British Columbia, because there's 203 First Nations in our province. There are a third of all First Nations in the country are in British Columbia, and almost all of them are untreated. So there's a lot of very active discussion there needs to be in order to settle a treaty or treaty-like relationships with First Nations here. And I think it's put British Columbia at the forefront of this discussion and how to operationalize a better relationship between the two. And in the course of my work as the premier, because we landed this $40 billion biggest private sector investment in Canadian history, LNG, and we had to do 60 agreements across British Columbia with First Nations to try and give them buy-in into the deal, like real buy-in, not political buy-in. It's real money, real ownership stake, real benefits. And that in the course of that, I met a lot of chiefs and vice chiefs who would say, well, I mean, we're not Canadians. And they've never thought of themselves as Canadians. They didn't think of themselves as British Columbians. They think of themselves as a member of their nation. And so it's, as Andre says, it is a very different proposition for, how do we include First Nations in a Canadian federation when many First Nations people don't have any affiliation. They've never been part of this idea that there's a fundamental bargain between French and English Canada, because they were deliberately shut out. And I think I would take a little bit of a different tack in terms of how to start with First Nations inclusion, rather than kind of figuring out first how to restructure the federation and the discussion, which I do think is important. I think for every apology and every expression of regret, every discussion of the need to reconcile with First Nations, there should be which is all, it's really pointing to the really sad facts of Canada's founding and operation. There should be, at the same time, an announcement, a discussion, an agreement of economic inclusion of First Nations, something real and hard and beneficial for First Nations on the other hand, because we do a lot of apologizing, we do a lot of studies, but we are doing so little in Canada to address the root cause of the issues in First Nations communities, which is poverty. And the only answer to poverty is the creation of wealth. The creation of wealth in the West mostly comes from the development of natural resources. And so governments, and Canada has utterly failed in this regard, has an obligation to ensure that First Nations are included as real beneficiaries of the economic spoils from resource development in Canada, so that they can become full participants in the economy. And once that happens, Indigenous communities have a basis from which a strong basis from which to wage their fight for their own future and their own sustainability, their a sustainable vision for where they want to be, rather than us trying to figure that out for them. Because, we've been trying to figure it out for First Nations for a long time, and we have utterly, utterly failed. The answer to me is economic inclusion first, and that's the practical side of it.
Thank you, Premier Clark. Premier Charest.
Well, thank you. And both Andre and Christy have said things that are significant. From Andre's comment, I find interesting, but Andre, and I'm interpreting on what part of what Andre is saying, but Andre's sort of saying, we don't quite know how to handle this, and we don't know by where to start or to end. And this is quite different from the Quebec question, obviously, very different. And I think there is a moment of humility for all of us here, and having the ability to recognize that, especially at this point, that we're going to grapple for some of the answers and how exactly does this work as we come forward. And Christy, the remark about the economic part is equally important. I'll move to that maybe a bit later, but let us go back a bit in time and back to this notion of Canada was a country founded by there were two founding nations, which is true. But what was equally true is that there was also many other nations here before we arrived in First Nations. And we did not at that time recognize them for who they were. And I'm not blaming anyone for that, by the way. I mean, all this historical revisionism about how things were before and trying to test these decisions and attitudes in regards to today's standards is a whole other debate. But what we saw and what I saw emerge was this affirmation of Canada's First Nations that really started around the patriation of the Constitution in 1980, adopted in 82. And there was a series of constitutional conferences on the future of First Nations that was baked into that agreement. The last one was in 1987, and it failed. It was chaired by the Mulroney government. The Bourassa government was at the table, and the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs at the time was Gilles Rémillard, who wrote a very interesting paper afterwards in which he said, we failed. Our failure at that conference set the stage for what followed in Meech and followed afterwards. And we should have been more aware at the time of how important it was for these First Nations to be recognized. And he was totally right. When Meech arrived, as you'll remember, the issue in the future of First Nations was a key part of the debate. And the First Nations at the time, I'm summing it up, I know, in much too strict terms, but their view was enough. If there's going to be change and we're not part of it, there will not be change. And what followed was, you'll remember, the failure of Meech, but also the attempt in Charlottetown to put the toothpaste back in the tube, which had a huge component of recognition of First Nations leadership. And then we moved to the period in which we're in now, when that failed also, the 95 referendum. And now we're just coming to grips with the fact that the First Nations in Canada are in a very difficult situation. And like other groups similar, and now I'm going to generalize, I don't want to trivialize any group in particular, but there's two things that I think they yearned for first in this period. One is recognition. And like a lot of other minority groups, but recognition means being named, being seen, being recognized. And the other is respect. They want to be respected. And so we're in this period of affirmation of our First Nations. And the country is responding to that by recognizing the injustices that have been caused to them and the fact that there needs to be some change, and call it reparation or reconciliation. And I'm not sure where we are in that process right now. I see reconciliation as the bridge between this period of reparation, but also the affirmation of First Nations taking their rightful place in the country, and of us figuring out how that works, how it happens. Back to what Christy said, though, in the end, the future of First Nations will depend on their the availability and their opportunity for economic viability. And in a lot of cases, they do not have access to that economic viability. We've created an apartheid system of reserves that we can't get rid of because we're not able, as back to Henri was saying, we can't figure out what the alternative is. We don't know. And since we don't know, we just can't change it. So we know what we have now is wrong in its design. We're living with it because we have to, and everyone, well, then this is true for First Nations as it is for us. We're living with it because we have to until we figure out how to move on beyond that. But we know that somewhere down the road that we have to figure out how that works. And it's going to be a great challenge to the country. Let me add one last thing. There was this notion, to be quite frank, it's Prime Minister Trudeau, Justin, who referred to this as Canada being a post-national state. I couldn't disagree more. I mean, it's one thing for us to be multicultural or intercultural, which is a concept I prefer in Quebec. But we do have two founding nations of French and English. We can't erase history. And we did not recognize the First Nations for what they represented at the time we created the country. But that doesn't mean that Canada's an empty shell without a history, without its culture, and without its own narrative. The challenge is tying that together in a single narrative. And that's where we are right now.
One of the issues that you all raised in your opening remarks, as you kind of gave, I think each of you kind of gave a sobering assessment of national unity. All of you raised the issue of Western alienation. Alberta has this referendum on the table to proposing to scrap the equalization from the Constitution. I want to kind of ask you each individual questions about this issue, and I want to begin with Professor Lecoul again, because you did some research recently, Professor, about public attitudes towards the equalization program. Can you kind of give us an overview of what you found and about what people think of the program and how those attitudes break down along regional lines?
Yeah, so I mean, in a nutshell, the findings on public opinion and equalization, most interesting finding is that, in non-recipient provinces, support for equalization is guided by the view of Quebec. So Canadians living in non-recipient provinces like Alberta are more likely to oppose equalization if they think that Quebec is unjustly favored in the Federation. So I think what this says is that, it's that maybe the issue is not about the equalization program in itself, right? And there's a broader issue linked to Western alienation, right? Linked to sentiments that the West has been historically marginalized in the Federation, and that in the context of projects for developing oil pipelines, for taking Alberta oil to new markets, which should presumably help boost the Alberta economy in a difficult time. I think equalization is, kind of a mirror of frustration in Alberta around progress that's deemed too weak on these projects, right? So at the same time, what we see is that support for equalization is really strong across the country, including in Alberta and in Saskatchewan. And that's something that, some provincial politicians right now don't mention, So, I think equalization has become a symbol, let's put it that way, right? It's a symbol for a whole bunch of things. And that's why, the Alberta government right now is not really proposing any specific reforms to equalization, interestingly, right? It's wanting people in the province to speak to equalization, but in a way that's presumably meant to, quote unquote, send a message about all kinds of things, right? So I think there are ways to improve the equalization program, and I have some ideas on that. But I think currently the politics of equalization is not very much about equalization.
Premier Clark, how does that resonate with you? In British Columbia, recipient province, there doesn't seem to be the same level of resentment towards Quebec. Correct me if I'm wrong. And there does seem to be support for the program. How do you explain that kind of combination of factors?
Well, I mean, Jonathan, just we have been almost entirely throughout our history a non-recipient province. We were for a period of time in the 80s. Well, not that short, I guess, but you know, Andre, you could correct me on this, but I think it was probably 7 years or something. Problem with equalization is once you get in, you can't get out, right? Even if you're back in the black. So that aside, I would, you know, I think there's a lot of support for equalization across the country because people like the idea that we support each other as Canadians. I do think that that is a uniting value for Canadians. So, and I think it's something we all know works. And I don't think most Western Canadians begrudge the idea that money is going to be leaving Western Canada and going to Central Canada. And I don't even, you know, and I think to the extent that people kind of understand the basics of how the system works, the idea that the resource rents go mostly, are mostly provincial and not much of it goes to the federal government. It's kind of a weird thing about the way the Constitution the BNA Act was drawn up in the first place. So I think most people kind of understand those things. The problem comes though, not when Alberta's doing really, really well. And Alberta's money is paying for healthcare for all of us, a huge chunk of the healthcare system for all of us, and not just for Quebec, but enabling healthcare transfers across the country when oil prices are high. It comes when Alberta's down, and when Alberta's economy is really hurting, and people are out of work, because oil prices are low. They look across the country. And that's when the opposition to our resource economy that comes from other provinces that benefit from it really starts to grate. And, now that Alberta is stirred up, angry, the referendum is certainly going to, I think, add to that level of angst in Western Canada. And oil prices are going up. We may be in a situation that Canada hasn't seen before, which is a rich Alberta that's sharing tons of resources from its energy economy with the rest of the country and is still really angry about the way the source of this wealth is being regarded by other Canadians. And the part of the argument that really makes sense to most people in Western Canada is to look at people in Central Canada who say Alberta and British Columbia shouldn't be producing these, and Saskatchewan, these natural resources, when at the same time, Canada is depending on resources from economies and societies that use slave labor, that don't send their workers home safe every day, that don't share the wealth with their poorest citizens, and that have very few environmental standards. That, I think, is the hypocrisy inherent in that really grates on people, especially in Alberta. And I think we do need to worry, Jonathan, about what's going to happen next, because oil is back, because demand for it is back post-pandemic. And when Alberta's got lots of money, will they start thinking, as Ralph Klein did, about pulling out of the national healthcare system altogether? About saying, we're not going to conform to the federal regulations around the Canada Health Act. We're going to fund our own healthcare system. Goodbye, federal government. Then I think we've got a real problem, because it seems to me like this discussion around the referendum, the discussion around equalization payments, ultimately could lead us to Alberta pulling out of not just the Canada Pension Plan, but even programs that are more fundamental to the country, like healthcare.
Premier Charest, as a Québécois, how do you respond to the findings of Professor Lecour that that there seems to be some kind of correspondence between attitudes towards equalization and call it an anti-Quebec sentiment? What is the source of that? How do you respond to that? How does it make you feel?
I agree with André Lecour's assessment. The debate on equalization is a pretext for a lot of other things. And especially if you go back to basics, and you'll very rapidly see that there's very little understanding of what equalization actually is and what it does. Very, very little. And at the highest level, by the way, very little. I mean, I probably count on the fingers of a single hand the number of people who actually understand how the equalization formula works.
They may be both on this call, Jean. Both
I think. Well, I know it's so complicated, but let's return to basics. Back to basics just for a short moment. Canada is one of the most decentralized federations in the world. The only other federation more decentralized than us is Belgium, and no one knows how Belgium works. And to Christie's point, the provinces have jurisdiction over natural resources, which is unusual for a federation. And so we have powers in the provinces that are similar to that of sovereign states. That being said, every federation in the world has an equalization scheme, either by that name or another scheme. Every single, the United States does regional economic development through the location of army bases or defense spending, for example. We do it in Canada. Australia has an equalization scheme. Centralized governments do. Everywhere there are equalization schemes, and for good reason, because there are areas that are more rich, and you want to offer an equal level of development for everyone, not unjustly, and so there's an example. And over the years, by the way, we've changed the formula. When I was in government, we changed the formula, calculating whether we include or do not include non-renewable natural resources in the calculation of. The other thing that needs to be said again, it's a federal program written into the Constitution. It's not a provincial program. Does it fund programs in Quebec that only Quebec has because we're getting money? No. Quebec pays much higher taxes than Alberta does so that they can pay for the programs that they have. It's not equalization. In fact, Quebec, of all the provinces that receives, has the lowest per capita transfer of the 5-6 provinces at least that receive equalization. Now, to give you another example of how it's not understood, when it was first put into question by Alberta, Premier Legault, who was part of minister in a government, made a statement saying, excuse me, equalization was one of the reasons why Quebec came into Confederation. I mean, we all said, what? Equalization happened in 1957. Now, the person saying this is the Premier of Quebec. So what can I tell you except this? I think we need to move beyond that debate, understand, and we need to adapt equalization and always update it. But we need to understand why this is happening, this debate. And it is because Alberta and Saskatchewan and a number of provinces feel that, frankly, when they're in trouble, no one cares. Mm-hmm. If you're in Alberta, so we have a problem and our energy industry goes south. No, the clear message they get from the rest of the country is we don't care. When in fact, you seem to care when we're doing well because we're actually feeding into the equalization scheme. And that's the bigger issue here. And the same is for Saskatchewan. So there is a longer term issue here. Equalization is part of that pretext, but let's not miss what is the essential point. What Albertans and people from Saskatchewan and elsewhere are saying to us is, you know what? We'd like you to care as much about us when things are not going well as you seem to be enthusiastic of sharing our wealth when things are going well. And are they wrong? I don't think they're wrong. I don't think they're wrong. When they want to build a pipeline to go east and the rest of the country says, well, no, well, excuse me. And back to Christie's point, so we're going to buy our oil from jurisdictions that don't share our values. And well, I think what they're justifiably saying is, well, maybe we need to have you on our side as much as we're on your side. when things are not going as well as we would want them to.
That I think that a nice segue to my next question about climate change, because I think it really raises the challenges that are created by the jurisdictional division over natural resources. No, so climate change obviously requires collective action, and yet often the efforts by the federal government to coordinate and harmonize Canada's response have been met with resistance at the provincial level. Regional economic interests are often seen to clash with federal environmental policies. So the question to all three of you, and perhaps we'll start this time with Premier Clark, how do we tackle climate change without damaging national unity?
Well, I would go back to 2015 when the federal government with our new prime minister brought together the Pan-Canadian Climate Conference, the goal being to set up a national regime for it. I was there. I was leading the only province in the country that has had at the time a full carbon tax, visible carbon tax. It's been recognized by the World Bank and the United Nations as one of the very best in the world. It was very effective at lowering the use of carbon producing fuels, fuels that were covered by the carbon tax, where they grew in the rest that the use of those grew in the rest of the country. And while the economy was growing faster in British Columbia than the rest of the country, the amount of the amount of that fuel covered by the carbon tax was actually shrinking. The only place where that happened. So the carbon tax was working, and we were leading the country. We walked into that meeting in 2015, and it was abundantly clear that the federal government's agenda was to have a fight with the provinces. It wasn't to put together a real pan-Canadian deal. It was to have a fight with Alberta and Saskatchewan. And it was a lost opportunity. There's no doubt about it. But it also, though, set an agenda that I think we're still on today of this conflict between the feds and the province, and kind of no one standing up for the things that bind us together. The answer, I think, for a national carbon strategy is to go where we've more or less kind of through mishap and circumstance ended up, which is having every province design its own method of doing this and recognize that for some provinces it's going to be a lot harder than others. But we walked into 2015 and we said to the federal government, look, if we had a deal before we went in there and said, look, if you guys will help us build the infrastructure between Site C, which is our new dam, going to be our new dam, and the oil sands, we can electrify the oil sands and vastly reduce its carbon footprint at the same time that we can continue to export oil that allows us to deliver the level of healthcare across Canada that we do. They agreed to it, and then they reneged on the deal. And I could go through a whole kind of list of those things, but I would argue that the reason we don't have a better, more cohesive, more thoughtful, more effective climate plan in Canada today is because the federal government hasn't been truly committed to actually putting that together. They see climate change as a political issue that divides the right way for them electorally, and they need enemies in order to get friends. And my experience of that overall really has colored my feeling about it. But I do think what we're going to need a federal government that, first of all, accepts that climate change is real, that accepts that carbon taxes are necessary and vital in order to fight climate change, and accepts that provinces have their own jurisdiction, and we can only do this if we're cooperating. And we haven't, no federal government so far in my lifetime has, well, since climate change has become an issue, has met those three tests.
Premier Charest, how would you respond to Premier Clark's proposals and this issue that climate change seems to require this collective action that the Federation has a tough time dealing with?
Well, and this is a very typical issue for a federal system like ours, which can be met. I mean, it's not beyond our reach to be able to find the right answers. But let me start at the very beginning and listening to Christy. And Christy, I hope I'm not stretching here, but I think I'm a fiscal conservative, and I think you're a fiscal conservative too. And fiscal conservatives believe in economic instruments in dealing with climate change, which include carbon taxes. I mean, I believe in the use of economic instruments because it's the most efficient, most socially fair way of dealing with the greenhouse gas emissions. My government implemented a very modest carbon tax in 2006, but the real example of a carbon tax was brought in by the government of which Christie was part of, the Liberal government in British Columbia, as she pointed out, which became a model that was quoted all over the world. Interestingly enough, they didn't wait for the federal government to do it. They didn't need the federal government to do it. They did it because they believed in it. And so we agree on this issue within Canada. But there is a bigger challenge of Canada having its own narrative on the issue of greenhouse gas emissions. For too long, we've been following and we haven't been shaping the debate. I'll give you an example. 20% of our energy is carbon in our electricity grid. It's 40% in at least is in the United States. No, 40% in Europe, 60% in the United States, 85% in China. I mean, we have a story to tell in terms of our performance on energy, but we don't seem to be able to tell it or to distinguish ourselves because we're following. And on climate, the issue for these policies, it's all in design. It has to be designed to be efficient in a very careful manner. Otherwise, you get all sorts of unintended consequences. And that's the problem that we're facing here. And in a federal system of government that's the most decentralized in the world cannot happen from the feds imposing it on the way down, because it won't work. You'll get resistance, and you're going to end up having a public policy that is not going to have buy-in, and it'll be self-defeating. So can we deal with climate change? Can we deal effectively with it? Yes, the answer is yes. But it's going to require a very different approach from the one of the feds doing top down, as opposed to the one that is work, which is going to be provincially led and one that is adapted to the circumstances of each individual province.
Professor Lacour, how does this issue look like to you from the academic perspective?
Well, I think whatever policies are formulated and implemented on climate change, I think they will introduce tensions in the federation, right? I think national unity or solidarity in the federation is political, and I'm not sure. I guess to answer your original question, I'm not sure that there's a way to address climate change in a way that's tensionless, right? I think that's probably beyond what can be done. I think we know what kind of cleavages there are in Canada. I think we know what the fault lines are. So, what do we do? Do we try to do a little bit of everything, which is, I think, what the Liberal government has tried to do? We'll authorize one pipeline development. Heck, we'll even buy it. We'll, not authorize a couple of more. I mean, that's an approach that's not entirely satisfactory to anybody, obviously. We could get even more aggressive on fighting climate change. But of course, politically, that will be difficult, right? Because provinces that produce non-renewable natural resources will see this as, we'll take it personal, I think, right? We'll see this as targeting them. Or we could take a much kind of looser approach on fighting climate change, but I don't think many people think that's a very good policy idea. And politically, that would also be, I think, difficult because there's a lot of Canadians and lots of provinces who value an aggressive fighting of climate change. So I'm not, on this issue, I'm not overly optimistic, actually, that it can be done in harmony. But of course, I think we have to put things in perspective. I think Premier Charest said it well. Canada is very decentralized, and in any federation, let alone a very decentralized one, intergovernmental conflict is part of political life. So the idea is not to get rid of them altogether, right? It's to manage them. And here I think there will have to be a lot of energy dedicated to managing intergovernmental relations as we pursue climate change policy, fighting climate change policy. Sorry.
I want to shift our focus here just for a little bit towards the Constitution, rights. Quebec invoked the notwithstanding clause to protect the Laicity Act or Bill 21 from court challenges. By doing so, Muslim women and other minorities now don't have access to the same rights in Quebec as they do in other provinces. What impact does using the notwithstanding clause in this way have on the Constitution, and what impact does it have on national unity more generally? Premier Charest, why don't you begin?
Well, let me start by saying something that may surprise some people in the audience. If Bill 21 had been presented elsewhere in Canada, I can pretty much guarantee you it would be popular. It would be a popular piece of legislation. People in Ontario, British Columbia, they probably agree with it. Because in politics, you have a choice. And in this period of populism, if you play to the lowest common denominator and you cultivate fear and you cultivate differences in people, you're going to get a pretty rapid reaction. So I would caution everyone here in the room to think this is just Quebec. And actually, the reality is, if Bill 21 were implemented elsewhere, it would probably be fairly popular. I don't agree with Bill 21. I'm among a minority here, but Bill 21, let me tell you, in Quebec, is very popular. It has a lot of support among francophones because it addresses that anxiety about, different. The problem and the defect with Bill 21, in my view, not just in my view, is that if you present any legislation that limits individual rights, the duty of the legislator is to give an empirical demonstration and evidence that there are reasons for doing that. Not because you feel that way, not because that's the sense you have, or because your humor is in that direction. In fact, that's why we have charters of rights, to avoid that, popular sentiment driving what should or should not be individual rights. Quebec never did that. Contrary, by the way, on language policy, that went all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, where the government of Quebec, in defending Bill 101 at the time, made an empirical demonstration that there were reasons why this legislation was presented to protect the future of the French language and culture. And the Supreme Court of Canada agreed with that rationale. On several and a few points, they didn't agree with the law, but that's what it is. So now, here we have a government who's using the notwithstanding clause on a blanket way for Bill 21 and Bill 96, which is also part of the discussion now. And not only is it, by the way, not only is it found contrary to the Canadian Charter, but also to the Quebec Charter of 1974. But in Quebec, no one mentions that. I mean, those who are defending the bill, as though it's only the federal government. Now, something happened that I find disturbing, Jonathan. The Premier of Quebec said, more or less, to the federal leaders in the last party, I don't want you to contest my bill. I don't want anyone to, no, don't do that. Which frankly is, since when do governments vote laws and then tell people, no, you should not, I don't want you to go to court to revise it or to look at, excuse me, we live in a democracy. I mean, we don't live in an authoritarian regime that says don't. And the federal leaders actually went along with it, as far as I could see. So what is the federal government going to do in front of the Supreme Court of Canada when Bill 21 eventually shows up, whether they're the one who drove the car to get there, the train to get there or not? Are they going to say to the Supreme Court of Canada, oh, I'm sorry, I'm neutral. We're the federal government of Canada, but no, I have no opinion on the Canadian Charter of Rights because, so it's a difficult issue because it speaks to feeding this sentiment. And people like me are very much in the minority in Quebec. But I think with time and with a little, experience with the legislation, that there are compromises and ways for us in dealing with some of the issues that people feel strongly about Bill 21 without restricting rights. And the government didn't feel that they had the patience to go there. But frankly, here is one area in which they should have. But again, in the rest of the country, be very careful. I think people should be very careful on how they judge Quebec in this regard, because they could be very easily comforted by the false sentiment that this is an issue that's only for Quebec, when in fact it is not.
With that word of caution, Premier Clark, what's your take?
I'm not going to repeat anything that Jean said, because I think he's right. And I think in particular, he's right that Bill 21 would be popular in lots of provinces. I mean, perhaps not quite so much in British Columbia, but I think it would certainly, it's a seller. So I'm not going to repeat that, but just to speak to the notwithstanding clause specifically, it is in the Constitution to protect the rights, not just of individuals, but to protect the provinces from the big foot of the federal government and of a federally appointed set of lifetime appointees on the Supreme Court. I mean, that's part of the reason that the notwithstanding clause is there, and it's part of the reason Quebec has used it, more than any other province in the country over the years, because Quebec has been the most protective of its rights as a province. And so when you look at some of the other uses of it across the country, Saskatchewan's a good example of that. Provinces have the right to do it. It's in the Constitution for a reason. It protects the Federation, I would argue, from the misuse or overuse of federal powers in a decentralized country. And I mean, my bias here, I should say, Jonathan, all begins with my view that our country is becoming sadly more centralized. The big foot of the federal government is getting heavier on the provinces at a time when our economic growth really depends on the provinces being able to have more power to be able to manage the economic unit that is a province. And so, in terms of the notwithstanding clause, it may become more useful over time rather than less, for economic reasons. But having said that, I mean, really, your question is about Bill 21, and I don't have anything that could improve on what Premier Charest had to say already from the Quebec perspective.
Professor Lacour, what's your take on Bill 21 as a national unity issue?
Well, first of all, I agree completely with Premier Clark that I have no problem with the use of the notwithstanding clause. I think it's constitutional. And I guess what troubles me is the reaction. I mean, I also oppose Bill 21 for full disclosure, and I guess I'm too much of a liberal a philosophical liberal, I guess, to accept it. But I'm really troubled by its reception in other provinces. And I think, to me, part of the reason why Bill 21 is popular in Quebec, and I think Jean Charest is absolutely right, it is extremely popular. And when you teach Francophone Quebecers, like I sometimes do, you see that, is that most Francophone Quebecers have very little understanding of religion, tend to be afraid of it, don't take it seriously. And so philosophical liberalism, I think, in Quebec emphasizes this, emphasizes secularism, right? Emphasizes laicite, emphasizes the separation of church and state, whereas liberalism in, I would say, most other provinces takes a more kind of conventional form focused on individual liberty. So I think there is, to make a long story short, I guess there is a historical and sociological root to this legislation that is, I think, poorly understood in other provinces. And I do think, on national unity, I think that's a layer here. I think this view in other provinces that Quebecers are intolerant, as presumably demonstrated by legislation such as Bill 21, I think that's troubling. Not exactly sure what we do about it, except for trying to kind of explain it. But that's sometimes a difficult task to do.
Okay, so we're almost out of time here, but before I let you guys go, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you a few closing thoughts. Short enough that we could put in a tweet, but a few closing thoughts on what should be done to strengthen national unity over the next 25 years. Premier Clark, you're on the spot first. Where do we go from here?
Instead of fighting with the provinces, the federal government needs to spend its time talking about the values that unite Canadians so that we all remember that we have something to fight for.
That's good. That fits in a tweet.
44, is it 44 letters or?
Premier Charest?
Well, I think the time may be approaching where we need to look at fundamental change in the country. And that may include constitutional change. And if I look at the next 25 years, and I had to make a choice, and this is a very unfair question, because if I had to make one choice, I think we could do Senate reform in the model of the German Bundestag. And that would address Western issues and issues all over the country that would be very significant. But, coming from someone who was involved in the last referendum campaign, that'll sound very risque, and separatists will applaud because they think this may be the next, opportunity for them. But I think Canada's going to have to face some moment of truth and say, we need and we can change the country and be successful about it. And that may be one of the changes. If I had to choose off the top of my head, I'd say that's one that I'd like to see happen.
And Professor LaCour?
Yeah, it's interesting. Jean Charest and we hadn't spoken before this conference, but I also had the idea of emulating a bit the German model for our Senate. I think to have provincial governments appoint senators, not triply, not equal number of senators per province, but something that can be a bit of a compromise between demographic representation and equality. I think that if we could have that once there, that would be useful. But the danger is getting there through constitutional negotiation. So that's the danger. More broadly, I think that we need to keep our federation dynamic, and we need to have Canadians see and think, including their political leaders, that change is possible in Canada. That if you're an Albertan politician, that change is possible in the federation, and that Alberta is not, without channels to push and be successful in pushing for change, without productive channels, which to me doesn't include a referendum on equalization.
Thank you all for what's been a truly fascinating conversation. Thank you, Mr. Charest, Ms. Clark, Professor LaCour, for being with us today. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this great conversation. On behalf of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, we hope that everyone enjoys watching the rest of the conference. Thank you, and all the best.